Hi guys, it is April from Getting Hookah With It. Today we are doing the top 10 books that I read in 2019. Let's get into it. So I didn't have a crazy, amazing reading year, I would say. I read around, I think it was 57 books in the end. I think I read a lot of 3 stars this year for some reason. I don't know why, but I did read some really great books too, and I want to share them with you. So this is in order. We are starting with my 10th top favorite book of the year, and then we're going to number 1. So I should mention I've got thrillers in here, I've got nonfiction in here, I've got some rereads in here. Get yourself a cuppa and let's begin. So in the number 10 spot, I kind of have a duo here because they go together really well. And it's Expecting Better and also Crib Sheet by Emily Oster. Now, Expecting Better is about pregnancy. Crib Sheet is about like newborn stage, birth to preschool. And so Emily Oster is a professor of economics. And so in pregnancy and also when you have a baby, you get a lot of advice from a lot of people and a lot of websites, and almost all of it is conflicting. And what I love about this is that she looks at studies and she cuts through the crap. She gets to the numbers and she studies the studies basically. She tells you whether it's a good study or a bad study. And she gives you the answers in these books so that, you know, you're not stuck wondering what is the best thing to do. She kind of lets you know and you get to decide for yourself, which I also really, really like. I will say, I think Expecting Better is the better of the two in some ways because there are more studies here. Here she'll talk about things like, can you have coffee or not when you're pregnant? What is the actual risk of having caffeine when you're pregnant? She talks about the tests that you'll sometimes go through when you're pregnant and whether they're worth it or not. In Crib Sheet, she talks about sleep training and breastfeeding and all sorts of stuff. And these 2 books have really helped me in this year, so I had to give that I had to make them both kind of my 10th spot because they really do go together so well. Next is a thriller. This is in the number 9 spot. This is The Turn of the Key by Ruth Ware. I never thought a Ruth Ware would land on my top 10 list. I read In a Dark, Dark Wood by Ruth Ware and I hated that book. But The Turn of the Key is a retelling of The Turn of the Screw, which is a great horror book by Henry James. Very disturbing. In this book, we meet Rowan Kane, and she stumbles across this ad where she would become a nanny for this architectural couple in the Scottish Highlands. They have built this really cool house. It was originally like I don't know if it's a period house, basically, like a Tudor house or I don't know what, but an older house, and they have absolutely added their own mix to it with all of these modern elements, lots of glass, and then also they've made it a smart home. And she gets there, she's taking care of these 3 kids, and the smart home starts turning on her, and it is so much fun. I found it really atmospheric. For a thriller, that's such a great thing to have in a thriller. I really liked the twists and turns. There were quite a few twists and turns in here. The kids were all individually really interesting characters. I really love it when a thriller can make the characters stand out and then also to be atmospheric as well. I really, really liked it. So The Turn of the Key was definitely had to go on my top 10 list. Next is another thriller. It's Lock Every Door by Riley Sager. This is pretty much a retelling of Rosemary's Baby, which I have not read. I've watched the movie. Now I need to read the book. One day I will. This is about a woman who is very much down on her luck. Her boyfriend has basically broken her heart. She found out he was cheating on her, so she has to leave. She's been couch surfing basically, and she finds an ad. Interesting, there's lots of ads in this top 10. She found an ad to be an apartment sitter in New York at the Bartholomew apartment building. And this building is meant to be like the cream of the crop. Everyone wants to live there. It's very hard to get in. And she gets to go and stay there and also be paid. She's like, this is the best thing ever. She's very excited. She goes there and she starts feeling very much watched. And the tenants of this apartment building are very strange individuals. There are so many rules that she has to follow. I think she's not really supposed to really talk to any of the tenants very much. She can't have people stay over the night. There's all sorts of weird rules that she accepts because of the situation that she's in, because she's kind of destitute. And she becomes more and more terrified, and you feel so trapped reading this book. Again, very atmospheric because of the descriptions of this apartment building. I found the tenants very creepy and strange a lot of the time. Very strange. And because she feels so trapped, you feel trapped and you feel kind of claustrophobic reading this. I loved that she didn't really have anyone to turn to, and those that she did kind of vanished a lot of the time. It was just so good. I am so glad that Riley Sager is writing. He plays with the horror genre in such a fun way, and I loved Lock Every Door. So that was no surprise. Riley Sager is just that good. Next up on the list is a historical fiction book. I think this might be the only historical fiction on the whole list. This is The Secret Life of Bees by Sue Monk Kidd. I read this in the summer this year, and it's such a good summer read. Oh my goodness. We follow this young woman. I think she's in her teens, and it's set in South Carolina in 1964. She has lost her mother. Her mother died when she was young. She has some memory of it because she was there when she died. And she really grapples throughout the book with that death and the loss of her mother and the hole that her mother's parting has left in her life. She lives with her father, who's not a great person. He's violent and has outbursts, and he's not close to her, and he just is not much of a father whatsoever. And she has this little box of memorabilia, basically, of her mother's. And she finds one day a candle in there. It's a black Mother Mary. It's from Tiburon, South Carolina. And one day, this woman who has really taken over as her maternal figure in her life, her name is Rosaline. She's a black woman. She's going to go and vote, I think, for the first time. And she's really excited. And a group of very racist men in this little town stop her, and she loses her mind on them. I loved Rosaline so much. She loses her mind on them, and basically Lily, our protagonist, has to break her out of jail, and they run away, and they go to Tiburon because she picks it out of thin air, but she really does that because of her mother and this memory of her mother and trying to find out who her mom really was. And so she goes there and she stays with these beekeeping sisters. They're all named after months, and I loved the characters so much in this book. I cared so deeply for Lily, and it was a very sad book in some ways because she's trying to grapple with the loss of her mother but also learn about her. So it's it's kind of full circle in some ways. She learns about herself. It's a growing up story, and she also learns about her mother at the same time and gets closure. And I just loved this book. It was wonderful. So The Secret Life of Bees is number 7. Number 6 is another thriller. I promise you this is not all thrillers, although I read a ton of thrillers this year. It's Sometimes I Lie by Alice Feeney. This is my first Alice Feeney, and this will not be my last. This follows a woman who is in a coma. She is aware of her surroundings, and her husband and her sister are right there beside her. It should be comforting, but she thinks one of them landed her in the coma in the first place. And so she is terrified of them. And we flash backwards and forwards in time. We follow her while she's in the coma. We follow her, I think, a week before that, when it's leading up to her going into the coma and the drama in her life at that point. And then you also have these diary entries, these childhood diary entries. And what I love so much about Alice Feeney is specifically what she does with childhood. She explores our characters as children, and most of the time something horrifying is happening in their childhood, and this is no exception. Those diary entries were very shocking. This thriller has the most twists and turns that I've read in any thriller. Like, truly, if you like twists and turns in your thrillers and you haven't read this, you must. I also really loved the character development. She writes really twisted characters in a fantastic way. And yeah, I loved Sometimes I Lie. I so highly recommend this one. Next is Educated by Tara Westover. Now, in my nonfiction, best of nonfiction, I had Expecting Better as my number 1. And this I only gave 4 stars, and I read it at the beginning of the year. But, this book stays with you. Yeah, I read it, I think in February or maybe even January, but it has stayed with me all this time, and I still think about Tara Westover a lot, and I wish her so well. This book is about Tara Westover's very strange childhood. She was raised by very religious people who didn't believe in education, didn't believe in the healthcare system. Her father was prone to violent outbursts, and she had a life, or she has had a life that I don't know if a lot of people could even dream of having so many things happen to you in your childhood. People would be injured in her life and no one would bring them to the hospital, or if they did, it was like a week later, and it was like a car crash with a head injury. Like, situations where you should be going to the hospital, they wouldn't go. And this is about her surviving her childhood and getting out. She luckily had an older brother that left this very small town and got educated himself, and he was someone that she looked up to, and luckily she followed. I think she ended up going to Cambridge and Harvard. Like, she's very well educated. She also really struggles in her childhood with abuse. She is physically and emotionally abused by her brother. And I'd never read anything about abuse from a sibling before, even though I imagine, maybe not common, but of course that would exist. But it had never entered my mind. I have a sister and we're very nice to each other, so like, we never fought physically or really emotionally. Like, I guess I'm very lucky. I know I'm very lucky. But just the trauma of that, it was very difficult to read, and it felt incredibly raw reading this. Like, I think that's still raw for her because she loved her brother, and she probably still does love her brother, but he was a horrific, horrible, horrible person, in my opinion. So I absolutely loved Educated. Yeah, that one really stayed with me. it kind of like the Glass Castle did. They're very similar. They could be like sisters. Those two women should go out for lunch and chat, because wow, the lives they lived. Next up is a book I don't have here anymore, but it's Pet Sematary by Stephen King. Oh man, I also never expected to have a Stephen King on my top 10 list. I don't know what to make of Stephen King. I've only read It by him and then Pet Sematary. I didn't really love It. I loved Pet Sematary. It's very emotional. This is about a family that moved to a small town. The dad has the opportunity to be a doctor in this small town, so he takes it. They move to this home with a very busy road, and lots of pets get killed on the road, unfortunately, because of transport trucks going back and forth and they get hit. Very sad. Their next door neighbor lets them know that there is a pet cemetery where you can go into this little patch, this little area of the cemetery, bury your pet, and the pet will come back to life. Not exactly the same, but actually quite different. But they're there, and this is about grief and loss. And this is actually, it is horror, but I think it's the most thoughtful horror that I've ever read. And it's the most emotional horror I've ever read. And very, very sad. I think Stephen King said that this was the darkest horror he's written, and he often wondered if he'd gone too far. But I'm really glad that he wrote this book, because it's about what would you do for your loved ones when pain is so visceral and is so fresh and horrible. What do you do? And I could understand these perspectives, and I absolutely loved it. There's also a side story in this book about the mom's childhood, and she had an older sister who was very, very ill and bedridden, and the way that she described her sister was terrifying, even though, you know, it was just her as a child not being able to understand her dying sister. Those scenes were truly some of the most terrifying scenes that I've read in horror books. So just wanted to mention that little aspect of it that I don't think a lot of people talk about, but it was really good. And then the last three are rereads. So we have in the number 3 spot, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. I absolutely loved The Handmaid's Tale and rereading it. I read this when I was in my early 20s and then reread it in my late 30s. We won't talk too much about that. But in my early 20s, I was in no way in a position of wanting to have a child. And in my late 30s, I've come through infertility, and also I've had a child. I read this when I was pregnant, and it was the best time to read it. This is a very dystopian world in which the women in America have been stripped of their rights. Infertility is very much on the rise, and they have chosen women who've been pregnant before and are of childbearing years. They've made them into handmaids, and these handmaids, their purpose is exclusively to bear children and to give children to Gilead, this place. And the rich, wealthy people who can afford to have handmaids and then take their children and raise them as their own. It's very disturbing. I found it really interesting to read this after experiencing infertility. Serena is the commander's wife, and she's completely fine with all of this. And it gave me a different perspective on Serena. When I read it in my 20s, I just hated Serena. That's her name, right? I just hated her. She was exclusively an evil woman in my mind. And then having gone through everything I've gone through, I don't agree with her at all doing what she did, allowing this to happen to this woman, Offred. but I could see how that could happen. I could see how she got there in her mind. It was wrong entirely, but I could see that. Also, reading this as a pregnant woman, I could completely understand Offred's perspective, and obviously how terrifying it would be to live in a world where you're not allowed to read. You're not allowed to have any purpose as a woman except as a mother. It is horrible, horrible, horrible. And yet, you know, Margaret Atwood wrote this, and everything she put in this was something that has happened in history. And I love that about this book. I still have to read the Testaments. I know I still haven't done it. But yeah, The Handmaid's Tale, I mean, classic. I get nervous talking about Serena and how I can understand her a little bit, because I don't want people to think that I would be in any way for Gilead. I would not be. I just think that I can. She made Serena into a very real person, with a ton of flaws, but also someone who has layers to her, which I liked. So next up in the number 2 spot is Jane Eyre. Oh my goodness, I read this in university, and I didn't really like Jane Eyre many years ago. And now I love Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is written by Charlotte Bronte. It's a classic, and this follows Jane throughout her whole life. She's an orphan, and she goes to stay with her aunt and her terrible cousins, and she moves on to a boarding house, and then moves on and eventually becomes a governess for this man, and she lives with him, and there's a relationship there, and I just really enjoyed Jane. I think when I read this in my 20s, I didn't really enjoy Jane. I didn't understand her as well as I do now, and maybe it's just having more time to live that's made me appreciate Jane more. I loved her resilience. I think when I was in my 20s, I didn't recognize Jane's resilience and her ability to stand on her own 2 feet and rely exclusively on herself. And as a woman in the 1800s, to stand on your own 2 feet and rely exclusively on yourself, that was a feat. Jane is just someone to be looked up to. For sure, I really, really loved every minute of reading this. And I read this actually while I was giving birth. Like, I was in labor. I had taken the epidural at this point. I was in labor reading Jane Eyre, and I'll never forget that. I will never forget that. It will always have a special place in my heart because of that as well. Yeah, I just love Jane Eyre. And then, okay, so number 1. This is actually going to, I think, surprise some people. It's another reread, and it's Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. For a long time, I thought Sharp Objects was my favorite Gillian Flynn, but it's definitely Gone Girl. Reading it again, I listened to this on audiobook, and it was so good. This is about a couple, Amy and Nick. Amy has gone missing, and everyone thinks Nick killed her. And the police are after him, the media is hounding him, and he doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know where Amy is. And you kind of swap back and forwards through Nick's experience of Amy being gone and Amy's diary entries. Now, this has a major twist, especially in the middle. There's a big, huge twist. So if you're not enjoying this book for a little while, you gotta keep going, because it really does shift and change. And I think this has some of my, well, one of my most favorite characters of all time, maybe my favorite character of all time. I found myself laughing a lot at the beginning of the book. There's a lot of relatable stuff at the beginning about dating, and talks about, you know, Amy dating Nick at the beginning and trying to be the cool girl, and oh my gosh, I have been there. And then her being like, screw that, I don't want to be the cool girl anymore. And I also can relate to that. Every single character in this book, except maybe the detectives, have been completely developed. Her parents are so bad. They're terrible parents. They're supposed to be psychiatrists, and yet they have like created a whole series, a children's book series called Amazing Amy. And so Amy has spent her whole life trying to live up to these expectations of other people. And it is about her experience. And I can't say so much about this book, even though I want to say so much, but I'm going to give away all sorts of stuff, so I won't do it. But what I loved about this book the most was you start out the book and you're laughing, and then it gets a little uncomfortable, and then by the end of it, you're just like, oh, I need to get out. I need to get out. And you're not even in the relationship, but you just want it to get out, and you're so grateful for your own relationships. And Gillian Flynn writes the most twisted people in books. I really think she does. She's just fantastic. And so, for those reasons, Gone Girl is my favorite. Just beautifully, maybe not beautifully, but grotesquely gorgeous writing. And yeah, I can't wait for Gillian to write something else, because this was the last book that she wrote, and it was published in 2012. So 8 years ago. We're ready for another Gillian Flynn. So that's my favorite book of the year. Let me know in the comments below what your favorite book that you read in 2019 was. I would love to know, and I will talk with you soon. Bye, guys.